And of course, I'm extremely grateful to our president keynote speaker, Dr. David Hershenov, for joining us this morning. Dr. Hershenov is professor of philosophy and co-director of the Ramanal Center for Clinical Ethics and Philosophy of Medicine at the University at Buffalo. He's written around 100 papers and book chapters on issues in ethics, metaphysics, and philosophy of religion, particularly around issues concerning personal identity and moral status, the topic of his talk today. His recent papers on the topic of today's talk include an alternative to the rational substance pro-life view, what must pro-lifers believe about the moral status of embryos, and how not to defend the unborn. He also has a book manuscript in progress on the topic called Health, Harm, and Potential. Today, he will be presenting a paper titled The Minimal Metaphysics Required for a Pro-Life Ethics. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Dr. Hershenov is a leading, if not the leading, pro-life philosopher in the field today. I certainly owe him a great debt for his influence on my own work. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. David Hershenov.
Thank you, Brian and Ben and Xavier, for organizing and all the work you did. And I want to thank the audience for zooming in, at least those paying attention and not putting the finishing touches on their own papers at this moment. All right, so the minimal metaphysics for a pro-life ethics. My thesis is that pro-lifers defend for unnecessary and contentious metaphysical claims, and some of them are biologically dubious. I think they can defend their pro-life position without any of the four being true. I think two of the claims are not only unnecessary but false. The other two unnecessary claims are probably true, although I hope one of them is false, as it makes the pro-lifer's job easier. So let me just first say what the four are, and then I'll go over them in detail. So the first one is, I think pro-lifers wrongly worry about fetuses being maternal parts. They argue that fetuses are contained within a pregnant woman. They're occupants. They may use the language of Smith and Brogard, that they're tenants or occupants in a niche, much like you are an occupant of your office and not a part of your office. But I think it would be best if this pro-life view was false. It would be better for pro-lifers if fetuses actually were parts of their mothers. There's three prominent abortion defenses become false on merely conceptual grounds. So I think it's probably pointless to spend time arguing, even if it's true that fetuses aren't parts of their mother. The second, I think, unnecessary and contentious metaphysical claim is that pro-lifers mistakenly fear that abortion's wrongness depends upon our having been embryos. Like Alex Pruss even has an article, I think, entitled "Abortion's Wrong Because I Was Once a Fetus or Embryo" or something like that. Marquis believed something similar, although he spent a lot of time arguing that he was once a very early embryo. He didn't need to. There could be something else there with a valuable future, even if it wasn't him. So I'm going to argue that even if you and I couldn't have been aborted as embryos, a distinct human animal with interest in the development of the brain and mental life that it will share with us will suffice for abortion's evil. Three, I'm going to suggest that pro-lifers erroneously believe that embryos are essentially rational substance. They may be right, although I suspect they're not. They don't need to be right. So the idea is supposedly this root or radical capacity for rationality is why they each have great moral status. I think it'll suffice if our embryos are contingently rather than essentially rational. And I think the latter, I'll argue, is bad biology and dubious metaphysics. I think this is the claim that will get me in the most trouble in the Q&A. The fourth claim that I don't think pro-lifers need to defend is they falsely claim that the active-passive potential distinction avoids reductios of potential. It's morally and metaphysically irrelevant. If it was true, I think it would bring biologically dubious substantial changes while bestowing elevated moral status on creatures without it and denying moral status to those with it. So I'll now go over these four in more detail, starting with the claim that I hope is false, as not only is its truth unnecessary to defend a pro-life position, pro-lifers are actually better off if it was false. And this is the idea of fetuses as maternal parts. Number 5 on the hand, fetuses as parts. So Kingma, Elson Kingma is most famously, I mean, she's started a cottage industry that claims that fetuses are parts on the basis of 4 criteria for individuating organisms: topological continuity, homeostatic maintenance, metabolic integration, and immunological recognition. So these are 4 criteria that different people in the philosophy of biology had put forth for individuating organisms from their parts and from other organisms. And so I'll go over them briefly. Topologically is the idea that the fetus is connected to the mother in the way parts are to the wholes. The fetus at one end, the umbilical cord is attached just as many stalks connect organs to the body. And it's in the, so it's not in the manner in which one organism is separated from another. And then at the other end, the placenta is intertwined with the tissues in the uterine wall. And that too is not the type of boundary that we normally find between distinct entities, where there would be a drop in density, air or water separated, or a very different physical type of material, like your plastic glass frames are separated from your fleshy parts, and your clothes from your fleshy parts. All right, the next idea is the mother is homeostatically maintains the fetus, keeping these vital values, temperature, et cetera, and safe parameters. The third, the metabolic criterion, is that the mother provides the fetus with food that provides the material and energy for bodybuilding, removes waste, et cetera. And finally, the mother's immune system doesn't see the fetus as a foreign body, but recognizes itself. Now, I suspect all 4 of these claims are false. I've seen unpublished papers by Maureen Conduct that she sent me, and one by my wife that challenging these claims. But I hope Maureen and my wife are wrong, because I think it's just great news for pro-lifers if fetuses are parts, despite what they seem to think. So number 6, my body, my choice is a popular slogan. And I'm not quite sure why pro-lifers fear the claim the fetus is a part, and abortion defenders seem to relish that prospect. But maybe one reason is if pregnant women could do whatever they want with the parts of the body. She owns her body, then she can dispose of her property as she wishes. And even if she doesn't own it, maybe self-autonomy. I mean, that's literally self-determination. And so the fetus is a part of herself. She can do what she wants with it. Maybe some people have a worry that parts, their interests and functions are contributing to the whole, and so the fetus wouldn't have its own interest. I don't think any of these are very good arguments. I mean, if the mother owns her body, the fetus owns his or her body, and thus they're co-owners, and co-owners can't do what they want with the property. And if it's not a matter of ownership, but just autonomy, conjoined twins share parts, they each can't do what they want with that part. Anyway, I don't want to belabor these points. I want to make a different claim. And that's 7, 3 pro-choice arguments will just fail on merely conceptual grounds. So if the fetus is a part of the mother, then the fetus can't violate a right against trespass. The fetus can't violate a mother's right to bodily integrity, at least if it's a healthy pregnancy. And it's usually a right to bodily integrity, or trespass, that's going to trigger a right to self-defense. So the good news is no moral heavy lifting would be required to dispatch these arguments. One doesn't need to defend a theory of the dignity of the fetus, its moral status, how mindless beings have interest and can be harmed. You don't have to give an account, morally relevant potential, defend a form of speciesism. You don't have to do any moral heavy lifting. I mean, it's one of the rare times you can win a philosophy debate with a dictionary. It just doesn't make sense if the fetus is a part. So let me just go over these briefly. 7A, trespass. So if maternal parts cannot be aborted on the grounds they are trespassing where they have no right to be, if fetuses are parts of the mother, right? They can't trespass any more than her limbs. I mean, Eileen McDonough has a book where she talks a lot about trespassing, and Judith Thompson uses some examples of trespassers, burglars, and expanding children and people seeds. But your limbs can't trespass on you. Your organs can't trespass. Your parts can't trespass. People may be misled because the fetus wasn't always a part, but if it became a part, the time in which it could trespass is gone. 7b, more importantly, bodily integrity. A fetus cannot violate the mother's integrity, even if they are unwanted and burdensome. So you may not like your nose, your ethnic nose. You may not like the weight you have. You may not like other features, but they are not violating your bodily integrity. And last, 7c, abortion is self-defense. It requires an imminent or ongoing violation of bodily integrity, but a healthy part can't do that. So if a right to bodily integrity is violated, that's not going to trigger a right to lethal self-defense. So you can't defend abortion on the basis of the mother's defending herself. You can't defend it that her right to bodily integrity has been violated, nor can you defend it that the fetus is a trespasser. And many people have made such arguments. I mean, McDonough, McMahon, Jane English all talk about the bodily integrity being violated, and it triggers a right to self-defense. And one other thing I want to say, which would be good news if this view was true, that the fetus really was a part. I fear it's not. I'm hoping that it is that abortion pills become less morally difficult for pro-lifers to argue against. And probably 2/3 of abortions may now be chemical abortions. So number 8, abortions become harder to justify as killings rather than cases of letting die if the fetus is a part lethally detached from support. Just as cutting off someone's head kills the head, or at least the cells within it. So the worry is that extraction abortions, like RU 4086, may appear to be discontinuing support, letting someone die rather than killing them. As many of you have probably done in your bioethics course, when you go over Thompson, you say, the violinist, there's a morally disanalogous aspect to this thought experiment. The violinist is allowed to die when it's detached. The fetus typically is killed. So people like Boonin and McMahon say if that's what the pro-lifers are going to rest their case on, then they won't have a defense against an extraction abortion, a pill or a hysterotomy. But I think parthood would render the pill a killing. It may still be a killing. It depends on the biology, but it certainly would be a killing if the fetus is a part. Now, this is not a mere conceptual claim like the first three. I mean, you can't win a dictionary. You got to do some philosophy. You have to argue non-equivalence of killing and letting die. But the idea is that the fetus is a part. To cut it off, you would be killing it. If you cut off a limb, if you cut off an organ, if you cut off someone's head, you've either killed those, or if they're not things that can be killed, their parts have been killed. It's not where you are just removing life support from something disconnected from it. I mean, for instance, if someone's decapitated, we can leave it aside, whether the metaphysics, do you remain briefly alive as the head or briefly alive as the body? Either case, that would be a killing, not letting die by cutting off the support of the other. All right, so the second claim I want to make that I think abortion pro-lifers should not bother defending is that abortion could be wrong even if we persons were never fetuses. So a lot of people try to solve the abortion debate with a quick metaphysical move. You and I never were early embryos or fetuses. I don't believe that's true, but I don't think it matters. So the idea here, number 9, is early abortion would just be akin to contraception. It would prevent us, we human persons who are distinct from human animals, from coming into existence. So if we're essentially minded, we don't come into existence until some months into a pregnancy, or even later. And you see this, Dean Stretton makes this argument, McMahon, and many others. So abortion becomes far less problematic, if at all. None of us could have been aborted in the first few months. of pregnancy if we are persons who are distinct from our animal, because we're essentially thinking beings, and so we won't come into existence until there's this ready-to-hand capacity for thought. But I'll say here, number 10, harming human animals. If mindless human animals have interest, right, and they're distinct from us human persons, but they're going to grow, they're going to share our brain, they're going to have thoughts and hopes and dreams and aspirations. And so if you kill a human animal, even if you're not killing us with an early abortion, you could be depriving them of a very valuable life, right? So it doesn't matter that we aren't human animals. I mean, of course, I think it's true that human persons are human animals. Many philosophers don't. Now, it's also contentious, although maybe not in this group, that mindless entities, mindless human animals can have interest and can be harmed. But with pro-lifers, this isn't so much a problem. Most of them think we were once mindless human persons and we could have been harmed by our death. It's when I'm arguing with pro-choicers, abortion defenders, then you have more work to do. But if mindless human animals have interest, and these interests are in developing the way we do, they could be greatly harmed. So at number 11, this interesting, fascinating metaphysical debate is really irrelevant to the abortion debate. Pro-lifers don't need to argue that we persons aren't identical to an animal. They can grant their opponent's view that persons are constituted by animals or persons are parts of animals. But all that we need to argue for is that that human animal has interest when it's mindless, will become a conscious subject with a sophisticated mental life, will be greatly harmed if it doesn't get there because of abortion. Okay, the next thing, then perhaps the most controversial, I don't know for sure, is I think we should abandon the rational substance view. This is a very popular view. So number 12, this is a view about the kind of being we are and where our moral status lies. So rational substance view devotees, Pat Lee, Frank Betworth, Moreland Ray, Jason Ebers, so many people claim human beings are essentially rational in virtue of a root radical capacity and thus have equal moral status, even if their mental capacities are not yet expressed. So, I mean, they're trying to combat the worry that if moral status would come in degrees, if it depends on some sort of psychological capability that we get gradually. Some people are more rational, more self-conscious, greater moral agents, and so on and so forth. And so the radical substance view, they try to say in a slogan that we're persons with potential. We're not potential persons. But I think there may be some dubious biology involved. So 13. So assume there's some genes necessary for rationality, and they're neutralized before they're even expressed. So it's an early embryo, doesn't have a brain. If you neutralize those genes, it'll lose this rational telos. And this will be, I think, has to be treated as substantial change and death. Genes in that brain and the rational mind weren't even yet expressed. So it's substantial change because there's this loss of this rational telos, which is essential. But it seems, these genes, since they're unexpressed, there's no biological processes have been interrupted. And I think substantial change of a living things will involve death. I mean, the living don't go out of existence and stay alive, or they go out of existence and they're neither alive or dead. When you die, you cease to instantiate life processes. And so death is just that, ceasing to instantiate life process, maybe with some qualifications for irreversibility. And so if something goes out of existence with substantial change, there's a death, but it just seems biologically, there's no death when something loses its rational telos. Number 14, this view seems also committed to fatal enhancements. What I would think is just an enhancement, making a being smarter, making it rational. The rational substance view entails an organism, say a chimp, or maybe some precursor for human beings, the Homo erectus, if they would have gone out of existence, if rationality producing genes were added to their embryo, or they would receive a human embryo cerebrum transplant, that would be substantial change. Frank Beckwith thinks that's like conception if you give someone a transplant of a rational cerebrum. And I just think that's very strange biology. If this cerebrum, like any other organ, gets assimilated, incorporated, not rejected, I don't see why that organism just became smarter rather than we have substantial change. And then in number 15, you get some puzzles with anencephalics. So the rational substance view entails that any creature which is rational is essentially rational, right? So if anencephalic humans were cured and belatedly grew upper brains, they were always rational beings. One defense of this view is put forth by Marine Conduct at 16. She talked about a developmental telos to grow a nervous system. And so you grow in this nervous system, but then one part of it doesn't develop, say the upper brain, the cerebrum. But there is this telos towards rational development. But I think the question is, was this telos necessary or contingent? Are we necessarily rational? Are we contingently rational? We're supposed to be rational, but we're also supposed to be sighted and ambulatory. And you could run the same argument that our visual cortex was being developed, but some lens or part of the eye never did. You wouldn't want to then assume from that we were essentially sighted rather than contingently sighted. 17, the transplant intuition. That's this idea that if you transplant your cerebrum and somehow your thoughts, beliefs, desires are realizing them, or maybe a larger part of the brain, you would switch bodies. And it may be a commitment of the rational substance view that you move with a transplanted cerebrum. Because it allows the person to continue to realize their essence or highest power. And you'll find this in pro-lifers like Alex Pruss, Jason Ebro, Mark Spencer. They think human animal can switch bodies, can move just by moving this one crucial organ. And this idea gets even made worse by this belief in hylomorphic survivalism. Hylomorphic survivalism will reinforce the transplant intuition, as the idea is that people can survive bodiless in purgatory after death, or in hell or heaven before the resurrection. So they exist with their soul as their only part. So we have an immaterial being with an immaterial part, and they're still animals because they have these capacities that if they were embodied would be doing these things. And so we have these rational animals, these disembodied animals. And so if you can survive in this interim state as an animal, rational animal, without a body, then I don't see why you couldn't survive as a cerebrum in a vat, or why you couldn't be moved from one fleshy body to another. The alternative view, if you know this debate, it's often a debate between Thomas, is a corruptionist view, and that between death and resurrection, it's your soul, but not you. Now, if you're a Cartesian, you don't have these problems. These are problems for people in the hylomorphic tradition. Lastly, also reinforcing this transplant intuition are these claims that you'll see in Jason Ebro and Melissa Michela, that in the case of extreme Guillain-Barré system, where nothing gets in and out of the brain, the being's conscious, but has no control over the rest of the body, completely locked in. They think since there isn't any of these vegetative type of functions under the control of the brain, nothing gets in and out, that the person has actually contracted and they've become brain size. So if you could become brain size or even smaller with extreme Guillain-Barré syndrome, then I don't see why you couldn't survive in the philosopher's thought experiment of a cerebral transplant. I hope that was clear. May not have been, we come back to it. But anyway, I want to say here in 18 that this gives rise to bad biology and bad metaphysics. So here's the setup to see why. So grandma is in a persistent vegetative state, but she still exists. Her soul's there, even though she can't think and reason and be conscious. Her soul is configuring the body and is responsible for these vegetative life processes. So that's evidence she's still there. It's just the injury has prevented her from thinking. So grandma exists in a PVS. Her cerebrum, let's say, is just destroyed, liquefied. And then Aunt Sally cerebrum is removed. And Aunt Sally is grandma's identical twin, so there's not going to be a rejection issue. And her cerebrum is put in where grandma's cerebrum had been. Then we have a puzzle. It looks like Aunt Sally, who was able to think when her cerebrum was attached to her old body, able to think when she was in the philosopher's brain, cerebrum in a vat. She should be able to think once this cerebrum sustained by grandma's body. And grandma, now with a successful organ transplant, should be able to think with this new cerebrum. And we thus have two thinking beings where we want one. And the way to avoid this is to either say that one sister or both cease to exist, despite there being no rejection of the organ being assimilated and supported by the body. So to say that grandma went out of existence or Aunt Sally went out of existence or both went out of existence strikes me as very bad biology and strange metaphysics. Also, when Sally's cerebrum has been removed, since, Aunt Sally is an organism, she's not a part or constituted by an organism, where there was an organism, we then have substantial change. What looks like Aunt Sally's life process is still continuing, minus the cerebrum, has to be a new organism, despite it looking like nothing has died or started. So 19, this dubious biology, sketchy metaphysics can be avoided, I think, if we just take the claim that we are contingently rational and essentially alive, rather than essentially rational. I think that would enable us to resist this transplant intuition where we become cerebrum sized and are moved. It would avoid these too many thinkers problem if Aunt Sally and grandma are going to both think with the same cerebrum. And we wouldn't have entities popping in and out of existence. Aunt Sally popping out of existence or grandma popping out of existence or both, when there just doesn't look like an interruption of life processes. So I think the minimal metaphysics we need is just that we are contingently rational. We're supposed to be rational. When we're healthy, we will be rational and develop sophisticated minds. So 20, a very quick a sketch of how I think of the moral status of the mindless is due to our being a kind of being, even contingently a member of that kind, capable of unrivaled levels of well-being after developing in a healthy mental manner. So if we undergo healthy development, and I'm mostly interested in mental development, psychological health, we will be rational, we'll be empathetic, prudent, loving, caring, so forth. So all these amazing cognitive and affective capacities that you can't do when there's various mental dysfunctions, when they hinder or prevent them. We're supposed to have brains. Even if it's just a contingent matter, we could exist if our brains don't do this, but we're supposed to reason, love, laugh, be able to restrain ourselves, sleep, have sex, so on and so forth. And our lives will go well when we do. We'll have abilities no other kind of being can rival, no other created living being can rival. And I think all we need is that to be a contingent feature of us. We don't have to be essentially rational. And I think essentially rational can get into some of those problems I mentioned. And so my view is a healthy embryo at every moment of its existence is making preparations to have this type of brain and mind. And it's in its interest when it's mindless that it develop in a way. Maybe it's only direct interest it has when it's mindless in being healthy, but when a human being is healthy, the well-being that it can obtain is unrivaled. Let me say 21, say a little something about moral status and well-being. Our moral status is retained despite internal or external barriers to our obtaining such well-being, as we are the kind of being that can do so and have an interest in doing so. So even if we don't develop, we're supposed to. We have an interest, I want to argue, in developing in a healthy manner, even when we're mindless, and we're greatly harmed when we don't. And beings of that kind that can be greatly harmed or benefited by healthy development, I think, have great moral status. All right, so 22, my account, I call it the healthy development account. That is our minimal metaphysical commitment is just, we're a type of being that is supposed to be rational. It can be contingent. We're unhealthy when we're not developing such minds. We have an interest in developing such minds, greatly harmed or benefited if we don't or do. We alone are unhealthy when we don't instantiate these features of personhood. So the last thing I want to say in number 4 is against the metaphysical and moral significance of an active-passive potential distinction. So pro-lifers think it's very important that we develop in a certain way. And so their opponents, abortion defenders, will put forth, the real cottage industry put forth reductios of potential. And Tooley's kitten's the most famous. This is a kitten, if you inject it, it'll develop into a person. You have no reason to, you haven't harmed it. If you haven't injected and you haven't harmed it, if you stop that development before, or neutralize it before it begins to develop. Other examples are these totipotent cells. Maybe an early embryo has 2 totipotent cells, either could become a human being if removed. And certainly we haven't wronged it by not removing it. And then they'll give examples of genes being knocked out or replaced, and we don't see our moral, and they claim your moral status isn't going to cycle back and forth. And what pro-lifers often do in response to such scenarios, and there's many other types of reductios with weird environments. You can move oysters to Mars and they'll develop into persons, say Hassoun and Kriegel. They just claim, look, these are all cases of passive potential, and it's active potential that is identity preserving. And so Tooley's cat went out of existence. It's a fatal enhancement, or not enhancement, it's a substantial change. And 24, I think, again, I've hinted at, I think this is bad biology. I find it hard to believe that rational enhancement is fatal. I also find it hard to believe that if you remove a totipotent cell from an embryo, switch it to a different place in the womb or a different womb, it would go out of existence when it was separated. I mean, I think the other cell was just masking its development. I don't think anything can go out of existence by removing something external to it. And I just find it hard to believe that a human fetus's moral status drops and then returns if rationality producing genes are removed, then restored. But if you don't like any of these examples, I think McMahon's dog really is problems for finding any significance in the notion of active potential. So McMahon made up this scenario where these dogs, if you just interacted with them as you do human children, they will develop language and become persons. You just have to put in hours and hours each day like we do with our own children. So it seems like they have active potential, but surely they don't have great moral status, and surely we haven't wronged them if we don't. Although Pat Lee, in response to Dean Stratton, thought maybe we do have to promote this development. But I think, look, these genes, they're just kind of like junk DNA. They're doing no work. Nothing in that dog's history made it such that it would be unhealthy if it didn't develop. And you can come up with other problems for active potential if you have a different metaphysics. Say you believe in something like unrestricted composition. Any 2 or more things will compose third or additional things. So imagine the sperm and egg before they've even fused. They exist. There they are in the womb. You might say there's an object there that in a later stage will be fused. It has active potential, but surely you haven't done anything wrong, or not a great wrong, if you prevent it from fusing. So the way I think we should look at these cases, and the way I think you should see that you don't need any appeal to active potential. You just need an appeal to healthy development. It can be passive. It can need all sorts of interventions. Genes could be missing and so forth. The way to think about morally relevant potential is just healthy development. And then you're not going to be bothered by any of these standard reductios that I'm aware of. So McMahon's dogs are not unhealthy if they don't become persons. They didn't evolved. They didn't have a long natural history where they became persons. Thule's cat is not unhealthy. A cell that you can induce to parthenogenetically develop, it's not unhealthy. An egg, if you don't induce it. These totipotent cells are not unhealthy if they're just submerged in a single embryo. None of these things are unhealthy. So I just think the minimal commitment you need is an interest in healthy development. And healthy development for us leads to unrivaled cognitive and affective abilities. And I think that's all we need. So to sum up, pro-lifers don't need to claim we're essentially rational. I think it's enough if we're contingently. We may be essentially rational, but all we need is that it's contingently. We don't have to argue that we're not parts of our mother. Abortion can be wrong, even if we human persons were never early human embryos, human animals. And we don't need the active and passive distinction to avoid reductios. We just need this interest in healthy development. And I'll let it go there.